Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm just watching the numbers here, watching everybody populate into the webinar. And as soon as it looks like we have all of our participants, we'll go ahead and get started. We've been remarkably successful with these programs, and I'm just so delighted to see the turnout and the interest that everyone has had for Tennessee history. It's interesting, we can track the participants geographically, and we've had people from Peru, we've had people from Australia, we've had people from Wales, we've had people from all around the world joining us to learn about our little corner of the world. So welcome tonight. My name is Jennifer Kaur. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society, and this is our fourth lecture in Tennessee 101, Tennessee during the Civil War years. This is the last session of this particular part of Tennessee 101, but do not worry, we will be continuing with Tennessee 101 starting in the fall. And Carol will have more information for you at the end of this program about that. I also do want to mention our next program will be our annual membership meeting. You can come to it even if you are not a member. Of course, we would like you to join as a member. And if you are a member, then you will get to vote on the slate of officers for the upcoming fiscal year. However, the meeting itself is open to the public. Our keynote speaker is going to be Dr. Marjorie Spruill, who will speak on the topic of One Woman, One Vote, woman suffrage in Tennessee. That will be on Tuesday, June 1st. And then we'll pick up with Tennessee 101 starting at the end of August 2021. Sorry. Okay, so our speaker tonight, as it has been in these last sessions, is Dr. Carol Busey. Dr. Busey is professor of history at Volunteer State Community College. She's also the Davidson County historian. And so tonight she's going to take us through the end of the Civil War. Carol, all yours.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate the introduction and appreciate all the kind words and notes I've received from so many of you with questions, with comments, with things about your family that I found personally very, very interesting. And I am really delighted once again to be here to talk to you about this subject. Now, tonight, we're going to talk a tremendous amount about the women, the people who were truly the home front. And as you know, it was quite a stressful time for those who were left behind, trying to make do with not only the armies themselves coming through various areas, but also from just marauders, just people who took advantage of the chaos and went out and stole chickens or did whatever they chose to do. So you see a lot of lawlessness taking place during this time, and even some family feuds trying to get settled during some of these particularly intense episodes of the war itself. Once again, East Tennessee strongly Unionist, but a few pockets of Confederates. And even though many of those counties voted not to secede, in many of those counties there were very ardent Confederate supporters. By and large, in East Tennessee, one historian has analyzed how those counties voted and who voted for secession. And they believe that some of the wealthier people in East Tennessee who owned a considerable number, and a considerable number in East Tennessee would probably have been 10 enslaved people. They were the people who generally supported secession, and the yeoman farmers and the business community, many of which had been those Whig politicians before the Whig Party died out, they supported the Union. West Tennessee, heavily pro-Confederate and pro-secession, with this one little row of counties that were pretty heavily Unionist. And then here we have Middle Tennessee in the middle, which in the second vote voted for secession because the war had begun after the attack on Fort Sumter. Now, in looking at all of these diaries, this list that I'm going to show you makes it look a little more skewed than it actually was. You see, I've got a long list of women who were Confederate women who kept diaries, and or else important things were written about them. In the case, for example, of Adelicia Ackland, whose name you see here, she herself did not keep a diary, but she did have a lot of activity during that period of time. Now, on the Union side, you see a relatively small list of Unionists. We know there were Unionists in all three grand divisions. I think that one thing that makes the distinction between the Confederate women who kept diaries and wrote a lot of letters and the Union women was that, by and large, the Confederate women who kept diaries had more financial stability. They were, by and large, wealthy women from families that owned enslaved people. They were educated women. They had access to paper and pen throughout the war, and many Union women did not have that strong of a level of education necessarily. Some did and some did not, and they also did not have access to the tools needed to keep a diary. In other words, they were really just trying to survive the war. As you see, my Middle Tennessee and then West Tennessee list continues here. And I know that I've left somebody's diary or letters off this list. This list is by no means complete. So if I have left off something that you think is important, by all means, please email me tonight or tomorrow and let me know, and I will be sure to put them in the list and put the diary on the bibliography that I've prepared for you as well. Now, back to this notion of these garrison towns, because I think this is quite important, because the Union Army came in, and as it occupied various cities or railroad lines, these became areas that were controlled by the Union Army. So you see here that there are a great many in Middle Tennessee, Knoxville, the Cumberland Gap here. This is probably Rogersville or Johnson City. I'm guessing this dot over here in Upper East Tennessee, several places along the Tennessee River coming down to Chattanooga, this Muscle Shoals area, down here just below Shiloh in northern Alabama and northern Mississippi, and then over here in Memphis. So these were garrison towns. And as Dr. Ash pointed out, the garrison towns were some of the safest places you could be throughout the Civil War. Now, the one caveat I would make to that is that a lot of these garrison towns, not Memphis, not Nashville, not Memphis, they went back and forth. That, for example, Shelbyville was controlled by the United States Army for a while, and then the Confederate Army for a while. So those were places that did not have the stability that a place like Nashville for sure had, Memphis, and even Knoxville, even though Knoxville had been controlled in the first half of the war by the Confederate Army, and then the Union Army liberated Knoxville in 1863. So here is this Confederate no man's land that you see surrounding. Oh, I lost that, didn't I? Here's the Confederate no man's land surrounding these garrison towns, and you get down in here in the Confederate frontier. But there was a lot of looting, bushwhacking activity in Confederate no man's land, and even down in the Confederate frontier to some degree. So let's start tonight's discussion with talking about East Tennessee and what was going on there. As I said this week, as well as last week and the week before, the Confederate Army came in and occupied Knoxville and, for all practical purposes, all of East Tennessee very early in the war, because Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Tennessee Governor Isham G. Harris were determined that that area that was so heavily pro-Union did not have the ability to leave the state. In other words, to secede from Tennessee, a seceded state. And so Knoxville is occupied by the Confederate Army, and it seems to be under control, but the Confederates will lose control when the Union Army is able to come into Hamilton County and take Chattanooga. Now, I want to begin by talking about Ellen House. She wrote a diary. She kept a diary throughout the Civil War. She lived in Knoxville, and she was a very, very unhappy supporter of the Confederacy. Her two brothers enlisted in the Confederate Army. She was fiercely partisan, very outspoken when she began her diary in early 1863, when the Union Army is getting ready to occupy the city. She was 20 years old, and so she had begun writing about what was going on in Knoxville because her brother Johnny, who was her favorite brother, he was just a little bit younger than she was doing this so that he would know what was going on. Both of her brothers ended up fairly quickly being imprisoned, and she worried about them quite a bit. They did indeed survive the war. She worked unceasingly for the Confederate cause while the Confederates were in charge of Knoxville, and then even after the Union Army came in and took over the city. She had been born in Savannah, Georgia. Her father was a tax collector and trade commissioner there. He decided, as many Southern men did, that he wanted to be a planter and have a more dignified life as that of an established Southern planter. So he moved his family up into North Georgia. But it turned out that he wasn't particularly successful as a Southern planter. And so when a business opportunity came up in Knoxville, he decided to move the family to Knoxville so that they could take advantage of this business opportunity and give up even attempting to have a plantation life whatsoever. So she gets very, very angry when the Union Army takes over the city and pushes the Confederates out. She felt the Confederates had not fought hard enough. She was very, very bitter. One of the things she wrote said, "The Yankees are here. Just think, here in Knoxville, walked in without the least resistance on our part to let them have the place. I could never have believed it." She was very, very bitter towards the Confederate General Simon Buckner, who had left the city unprotected. She recovers from the shock of that, but when she recovers from the shock of that, she's now really focused on the Confederate liberation of her city. She expected General Longstreet to come in any day and return Knoxville to its rightful position as a Confederate city. Lots and lots of rumors went around the city about that. She was confident he was coming. She was confident that the South had just been temporarily overpowered, but certainly not had been whipped. So she began seeing Confederates as prisoners being marched by their house. She stood at the front door of their house in Knoxville, along with other Confederate women, waving a handkerchief until the federal adjutant general arrived on the scene, sent two of those young women who were waving handkerchiefs immediately south behind Confederate lines. And what House wrote that day was, "Oh, I wish they had sent me." She was so eager to get out of Knoxville, especially when these Union soldiers come in. There is a siege that lasts several weeks in November of 1863. The suspense of all of this really disturbed her. She said on one of her accounts of what was going on, "There's just total chaos. Cavalry are racing in Main Street and out Cumberland, in Cumberland Street and out Main Street. Nobody seems to know where they are going, what they're after, or what they're doing. Such a flurry as they are all in, and such long faces. They are planting cannon all around the town, but I don't think the cannon will save them. Picket firing can be heard in every direction. And so she left a very dramatic account of what was going on in Knoxville. Now, in the county, very, very close, adjoining actually Knox County, is the Blount County, which is where Maryville is. Maryville, Tennessee is the county seat of Blount County. And there in Blount County, very strongly Unionist county, this young woman, Cynthia Dunn, decided that she was going to organize a group of home guards to show that they supported the Union. These were young women. They didn't really put on uniforms or do a lot of training and drilling, but she did organize this group just to show her support for the Union. In Knoxville, the Confederate sympathizers did things like making clothing for the Confederate men that were held in a Union prison in Knoxville or a Union jail. They tried to get food in and out to the prisons where the Confederates were held, but she was in Maryville with a substantial amount of support from this guard that she had created. You know, one of the things that takes place that is very controversial during the Civil War is that in these various attacks on cities, both armies were using sharpshooters. In other words, men who were shooting at a target from a long way away, and the target could not see that sharpshooter because of the distance of the shot. And so this was one of the subjects that was very, very controversial here. The sharpshooters really, this looked like a morality issue, particularly for some of the Confederate supporting women. Now, another woman from East Tennessee who supported the Confederacy was Eliza Ray Anderson Fain. She was a highly religious woman. She lived in Rogersville, Tennessee, which is not too far from Knoxville to the east. And she did not think that God would allow anything to happen to the Confederate men who were fighting and to what was going on. She really was highly distressed as things began to turn in favor of the Union. She really was distressed at the thought that the Confederates could possibly lose this war. Now, here is one passage early, very, very early in her diary. How little they, the Northerners, know of the deep anguish many of us feel in regard to our servants for their immortal souls. And I do feel the judgments of the Almighty God will rest upon the heads of the Northern people for their unjust interference, thereby thwarting our plans for elevation of our colored people in a moral point of view. In other words, what she's trying to convince herself is that these enslaved people are better off being enslaved as Southerners, where their owners are so concerned about their morality and moral training than they're going to be when they are freed by the Union Army. She clearly is a supporter of slavery, and she is a supporter of the Confederacy. Her diary is quite interesting to read because it is just filled with religious imagery and all of her views that God may be abandoning the Confederacy. I am becoming more firmly fixed in my conviction concerning this war that religion will be more intimately interwoven in its history than any which had ever preceded it. The men who have honored God are the men he has chosen to honor on almost every field. Again, she's talking about the Confederate Army. This is definitely wishful thinking on her part as she continues to hold out hope for the Confederacy to come and really have a showing and do quite well She was described in the preface to her diary as an evangelical Presbyterian. She had a deep belief in predestination, and she believed that slavery was ordained by God. Now, a third East Tennessee woman who also supports the Confederacy is Myra Inman. Myra Inman is from Cleveland, Tennessee. Cleveland, Tennessee is, I would say, slightly northeast of Chattanooga. It is down in that corner of the states. It's not quite in the mountains, but it is at the edge of the mountains in the Great Valley of the Tennessee. And so here we see Myra Inman, a young woman. She's educated. She had attended the Cleveland Masonic Female Academy there. She had a very fine education. She was regarded as a very accomplished seamstress and quite a musician. And she devoted most of her time in the early days of the war to socializing with her local friends, sewing and reading. She was a very, very ardent reader, and that comes through in the pages of her diary because she writes about all the various things that she has been reading. And her reading list is all the way from Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, by the way, was never banned by the Tennessee General Assembly, as far as I have been able to determine by going back through the legislative journals. It never was banned in Tennessee as it was in some states. But she also read The Vicar of Wakefield. So she had quite a long reading period almost every day. And she had tremendous access to books, probably through this school's library, but she was always reading and then writing about what she had read. She often wrote about how badly she felt. She would refer to feeling blue, but she would never blame it on the war. I think when she wrote her diary, she was much more concerned that somebody might read her diary than other writers were. And so I think she was very, very cautious while she writes in her diary. Now, a little bit of personal information about Myra Inman. Her father had died in 1851, leaving his wife to support her family, which were pretty young. Her children were quite young, and so Myra's mother had to rent out rooms in the house to boarders just to make ends meet. During the Civil War, she often had Union soldiers and on other times Confederate soldiers boarding in her home. But it really intensifies the activity in her home, really intensifies in that summer of 1863, which is that major turning point in the Civil War nationally, when the Battle of Gettysburg takes place and the Mississippi River is completely open to the Union Army during the summer of 1863. So Myra is watching all of this. Her mother allows the Union soldiers to, what she wrote down as, court her daughters. One Union soldier even proposed to Myra, but her feelings prevented her from accepting his proposal. And this is what she wrote about this. He loves me. I dislike him. He is a Yank. So she kept hoping that as soon as the Confederates took over Chattanooga for good, that the Confederates would come to Cleveland and liberate Cleveland. When the war ended, many people I won't say many, some people living in Cleveland, for whatever reason, decided to migrate to South America. She wanted to go, but she ended up, as all of these young women end up somehow doing, marrying a young man and living in Cleveland for the rest of her life. Her diary has also been published, as has the Thane diary and the House diary. These have all been published, and they're really quite interesting to read. I will say this about Ellen Renshaw House. Yes, she was an ardent, a very, very radical Confederate, very angry at the Union Army. She finally got her wish, and she finally got exiled out of Knoxville and into the South. So she left Knoxville after that time. Now, an interesting group that gets national attention from time to time because it is quite unique are the Ray County Spartans. Ray County is on the Tennessee River. The county seat of Ray County is Athens, Tennessee, which notoriety is primarily that in 1925, the Scopes trial took place in Athens. But it's a lovely place, a beautiful view of the Tennessee River in Ray County. And a group of young women in Ray County, when all of the young men went off to war, a lot of young women were rather bored. And so they decided they were going to do something besides can food for the Confederate Army and make uniforms or bandages. They decided to make themselves into a military unit. And they were not going to be making quilts. They were going to be in the Army. Now, how did they accomplish this? Well, they made themselves some uniforms. These again were elite white women, young women, teenagers, and some in their 20s. They were excellent horsemen. Again, another symbol of being an elite woman is being trained to ride a horse. So they were definitely excellent riders, and they formed themselves a cavalry unit. Now, the numbers, you read all about this group, they're all over the internet and in a lot of books as well. The numbers differ. Some say 15, some say as many as 30. But what we do know is they were going to help the Confederacy as much as they could. So what they began doing is delivering food to Confederates out in the countryside. They are, this is an interesting thing. They have uniforms and are wearing uniforms, but they continued to ride side saddle. I can't imagine why they wouldn't ride astride a horse, but nonetheless, they continued this activity. And the Union Army by late 1863 now controls all of Chattanooga, all of Knoxville, and the area around both of those cities. And so it really makes the work of the Ray County girls more difficult. Well, sooner or later, they're going to get caught. And they are getting caught by a young Ray County man himself who's in the Army, John Walker. He had formed an infantry unit, and he knew all about these girls. So he decided he is going to teach these girls a lesson. He raided one of their secret gatherings, always in churches, so that people would not think they were doing anything other than the Lord's work. He decides he's going to take them prisoner, which he does, and then he marches these women over to the Tennessee River, 5 miles through what amounted to mud and just a generally miserable walk. And then he puts them on a boat and takes them to Chattanooga, to the federal headquarters, where he turns them in. Now, later, this young man, John Walker, referred to him as the chicken thief, because he had stolen these girls from their farms. Well, the girls get to Chattanooga. Timing is everything, and the timing was interesting here. On April the 9th, 1865, the Ray County Spartans appear before Major General James Stedman, who is in charge of the entire area there. He was really mad at Walker when he found out that the cavalry unit Walker had imprisoned were women. And so he sent these young women home without any punishment whatsoever. And the war was, in fact, really, really over by this time. So you've got all manner of activity in East Tennessee, and the Union women that we know were there were the Brownlow women, Gordon Brown, William Brownlow's wife and daughter. They did not keep diaries. And we also know Eliza McCardle Johnson, the wife of military governor Andrew Johnson, was in Greenville, Tennessee, but she did not keep a diary either. So we know there was a lot of support for the Union Army of women, but they were not the ones who necessarily had access to paper and the educational level required and self-discipline to keep a diary going or to write letters. So let's move right on to Middle Tennessee here, and I want to showcase a few diaries that were written here, which once again are quite interesting. Here you see this star. Nashville on the Cumberland River is a garrison town, very safe in Nashville. Out here in the countryside, not so safe. Lots of raiding going on here in Rutherford County, Bedford County, Marshall County. There's a lot of Confederate raiding taking place in these counties. So we start with a Murfreesboro girl. And after the Confederates have raided the city, Kate Carney writes, "We can scarcely realize the joy of being free." The Union Army had occupied the city in early 1862. And then here came the Confederates, and who locked up all the Union officials for a brief period of time. But her family did not have good relations with, as you can imagine, the Union officers when they come back and liberate the city again. They refused, all of the members of her family apparently refused to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. They sheltered Confederate escapees when they could. They brought in provisions and did what they could to help the Confederate Army. And in many ways, her diary reads almost like Ellen Renshaw House's diary, adamantly anti-Union, much more so than her parents. And she used her enslaved household workers as intermediaries to kind of sneak messages back and forth when she could. She becomes despondent when she learns that the Confederates aren't having much military success. She has a very, very dramatic account in her diary of a raid by Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest when he raided Murfreesboro in the middle of the summer in 1862. And she claimed in her diary that she hissed at the Union soldiers as they retreated through the Carneys' property north of town, and then when fleeing, and so she asked some of the Union soldiers asked her father for shelter, which he told them to move on, and she was quite happy about that. But then you see that the Union Army has come in. Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry unit have taken the city, but Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry unit move on. They do not stay. And she really quits writing after that. She was so despondent when Forrest left the city that she did not write anymore. Another Rutherford County young woman is Mary Elizabeth Blackmore. She is of a very well-known and well-established Rutherford County family, the Ridley family. She is married by this time. Her father was a prominent judge, probably one of the wealthiest men in that entire part of the country. She had married a doctor in 1855. she actually opened a school during the Civil War and ran a school for children during part of the Civil War. She was a teacher. It was a co-ed school for young children. But she was there in her home when the Battle of Stones River took place, beginning on December 31st, 1862. The Confederate Army, now led by General Braxton Bragg, is once again trying to capture Nashville to, as in their mind, liberate the city. And so the Union officials in Nashville had coming down what the people in Nashville call the Murfreesboro Pike and the people in Rutherford County call the Nashville Pike. They come out of the city, camp on the hills just outside of Murfreesboro, and on December 31st, the fighting began. Now, if that is a really interesting battlefield, I will pause and make this statement. It is a fascinating terrain on which that battle was fought. It lasted over 3 days. It's well interpreted. It is run by the National Park Service, as are most of the battlefields in Tennessee. This is what she said about the day of the battle. The flash, the smoke, the click of small arms, deploying troops in an open field, the shouts and the curses of infuriated soldiers created a memorable scent. At last, the bloody struggle ended. Bragg withdrew, and we were surrounded by a desperate but victorious foe. My father left home for safety, taking my youngest sister, 13 years old of age. My brothers and husband were with their respective commands, leaving my mother and me here to pretty much fend for themselves with no protection. She was, in fact, scared to death. And then what begins after that is a period of time throughout the early months of 1863 that she referred to as the Terror. She wrote that in a period of 4 weeks, the Union Army, now commanding Murfreesboro, burned 17 cotton gins as well as houses in the area. And then on February 11th, 1863, the Federal soldiers appear at her family home. And again, the men, her brothers and husband are fighting in the war, and her father has left for his own safety. And here comes the Federal Army. They burn to the ground the Ridley's spectacular house Fairmont. In the middle of the night, she wrote that the only thing that saved her, her grandmother, and her mother there was the fact that the little family dog Carlo barked so loudly and for such a long period of time that they were able to get out of the house. But she wrote that they lost all of their precious possessions. An old cradle that every child in the family had been rocked in, a family Bible, numerous portraits, and probably one of the most valuable things, the most valuable thing in this house was her father's incredibly large library. All of it went up in flames. When the smoke settled, all that remained of that house were 3 chimneys, nothing else. Now, the Union Army is in Murfreesboro, and it's going to remain there. I think many Southerners who owned enslaved people really thought that the enslaved people were going to be very afraid of the Union Army and really distressed that these soldiers were around. And so you can imagine how shocking it was to the people who owned slaves in this county that many of these enslaved people saw the Union soldiers as their liberators. And then they really, really got angry when they learned that President Lincoln had signed an order to allow the Federal Army of the Cumberland, the army that was in control of Middle Tennessee, to recruit African American men, whether they were enslaved or free, to be members of the U.S. colored troops. And they recruited, the Union Army recruited these people in Murfreesboro, in Shelbyville, in Wartrace in Bedford County. And this became even more and more common in late 1864. And so she kept her diary and wrote about all of these things taking place. But her side actually ended up, once again, not meeting the expectations that she had for them. These railroad lines, particularly these down here around Murfreesboro, which is not really on this map here, but you see Shelbyville, Wartrace, Fayetteville, Tullahoma. The railroad lines there were of critical importance to both armies. Although the Confederates did not surrender at the Battle of Stones River, the fact that they retreated was a technical victory. And so throughout the winter, the Confederate Army backs down in here. They will eventually get down here in North Georgia, where the Battle of Chickamauga will be fought in North Georgia, and then Chattanooga. But this area here sees a lot of action, particularly Shelbyville. It goes back and forth, Union controlled, Confederate controlled throughout the rest of the war from this period of time. Neither army could really completely hold that city. Now, again, Nashville probably was, of all the Tennessee cities, the safest place you could be in the war. There were certainly a lot of women in town who supported the Confederacy. There were a lot of women in town who were not in favor of secession, but their sons had enlisted in the Confederate Army, and so they tacitly supported the Confederate Army because they did not want anything to happen to their sons. And so here we see Felicia Grundy Porter, the daughter of one of the youngest children of Anne Rogers and Felix Grundy. Felix Grundy, very prominent politician, a judge, a United States senator. And she decides that she's got to organize the Nashville women to help the cause of the Confederacy. So she founds the Soldiers Relief Society, and as you see this list of these women, it's the Society for All of Tennessee, and she makes whatever effort she can to communicate with other women supporting the Confederacy in other towns. You will note here, if you look over this list, there is the name of Mrs. Acklin. That would be Adelicia Hayes Franklin Acklin, whose husband will die down in Louisiana fairly early in the war, not because he was in the Army, but he had gone down there to try to get her cotton crop through the Union lines, which controlled New Orleans, and out the port to be sold in England. In other words, bribing blockade runners to get them to take her cotton crop. You see, when her husband, Isaac Franklin, died, Isaac Franklin was probably one of the wealthiest people in the United States, certainly in the South. He had made his money by being a merchant of humans. He was a slave dealer. He made a fortune in that business before he decided to get out of the business and create himself a new image as a proper Southern gentleman. You know, it's fascinating that Southerners could make selling slaves and buying enslaved people and then selling them for a profit. That was on the spectrum of sins. That was much worse than merely owning human beings in the South. So among the many things he and his partner, John Armfield, did was bring the business of the selling of humans and run it like a business, and they made it quite profitable. So they had an office in Alexandria where primarily Armfield worked, and then they had an office in Natchez, Mississippi, and in New Orleans. and they made lots and lots of money in the slave trade. So Adelicia Ackland has this enormous cotton crop because her husband, who had died, Isaac Franklin, had left all of this to essentially to her. There was some dealing with his will that some people got angry about, but she had large plantations in Louisiana. And when she married Joseph Ackland, who was from Alabama, she made him sign a prenup, which he actually did. Well, he got some kind of disease or was in a carriage accident. I've read 2 or 3 different things about how Joseph Ackland died, but she did manage to get her cotton crop through the blockade, the naval blockade, and sell her crop. So she pretty much left Nashville after that period of time. She will come back and marry someone here, but she was a supporter of the Confederacy. Her house there, which is Belmont, which is on what would be the edge of Nashville at this time, a little bit out in the frontier, but not very far out. The grande dame of Nashville was Sarah Childress Polk, widow of President James K. Polk. She and President Polk had had no children. They had come back to Nashville after he served his 1 term in office. When he campaigned for the presidency, he made it clear that if elected, he would only serve 1 term, and he held to that promise. So she held court here. She was a supporter of the Confederacy. She owned an absentee landlord plantation down in Mississippi. She had an overseer there. They had about 40 slaves down there. She had also nephews in the Confederate Army. But even when General Grant came to town, General Grant did pay a social call, a courtesy call on Mrs. Polk. About 2 blocks from Mrs. Polk there, right in the shadow of the Capitol, lived the Carter family. Their daughter, Rachel Carter Craighead, was married to Tom Craighead, a descendant of a minister's family. Her brother was killed. Rachel kept a really wonderful diary. Her brother was killed. Well, he died from wounds sustained at the Battle of Perryville. Her mother will go up to Perryville, where he is being taken care of in a home, and Rachel will go up there with her mother and is there when her brother dies. It is the turning point in her life. And from this point forward, she writes a great deal about the death of her brother. Now, her husband, Tom Craighead, is an interesting person. He was certainly not too old to fight, but he was not in either army. And you see him doing a tremendous amount of traveling during the Civil War. It's really somewhat mysterious. He's in Arkansas for a while. And after her brother died, he, trying to make her feel better and console her, decided that he would take her on a trip to New York City. And so this is one of the more remarkable things that takes place during the Civil War, is when she is taken to New York City by her husband for an 8-week trip. In the middle, they got through the Union lines, through the Confederate lines, and got into New York City. She writes a great deal about what she did there in New York City. He took her shopping. She bought herself an emerald and had it set between 2 diamonds. They went to the theater. She bought herself and one of her aunt's dresses that cost, she wrote, $490. She had quite a lovely time. And so she was not really suffering any deprivation whatsoever. They do return to Nashville. They are in Nashville when word comes that President Lincoln has been reelected with Andrew Johnson, whom the Craighead Carter family knew quite well. they really despised him as the running mate of President Lincoln. So she writes about this. Then she writes about the death of Abraham Lincoln, which actually she saw as a great tragedy because it meant that Johnson was going to be president. This is the mausoleum, the vault that her father built for her brother when he died. It is one of the most elaborate vaults you will ever see. She is buried in there along with her husband, and lots of relatives are buried in there and on the ground surrounding this solid marble vault in the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Nashville. Maggie Lindsley is one of our Unionists. She supports the United States. Her family all supported the Union Army. Her uncle, John Berrien Lindsley, was able to keep the University of Nashville open during the war. Her father, Adrian Van Sideren Lindsley, became the Postmaster General of Nashville when Andrew Johnson became military governor and gave him that appointment. She writes great descriptions of the Battle of Nashville and the smoke that she can smell, the trees that are being cut. She worries about her friends who were out in the Confederate countryside. It's really quite an interesting diary to read because of her descriptions. She can see from afar the Battle of Franklin on November 30th, and then she's an eyewitness to the Battle of Nashville, December 16th, 1864. Now, this is one thing interesting that she writes, that during the battle, she and a federal officer were at her home reading Thackeray. She describes the noise that is made. She knows that the Union is going to win this battle, and indeed they do. So her family sends her brothers to the east to be educated out of Nashville before the war ends in early 1865. And they send her with her brothers to live with an aunt who lives in Washington, D.C. She attended Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, which you can just imagine what it must have been like for this young woman to hear him saying, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, let us bind up our nation's wounds." That didn't quite exactly happen. So another story I want to bring to your attention is from Davidson County out in the hinterlands. And here is Susanna McGavock Carter, an enslaved woman, a lady's maid for Elizabeth McGavock Harding. She lives on the Belmead plantation. She knows how to read and write. When General Harding, Mrs. Harding's husband, is sent to a prison in Michigan, Mackinac Island prison, because he refuses to take the oath of allegiance, she has to kind of help Mrs. Harding run the plantation because Mrs. Harding is feeling very incapable of doing this. She will be the one, Susanna, who will read General Harding's letters to the staff and Mrs. Harding, which seems to provide her, she writes, some comfort. And so we have two highly remarkable letters that she wrote to her master, General Harding. And this is quite remarkable. You'll have to take the time to read these when I put the PowerPoint up tonight, but it is quite a remarkable letter. He owned 136 slaves, enslaved people. 125 left during the Civil War. And so she writes that she's trying to help the mistress out because the mistress thinks that she, Susanna, can run things better than the mistress is. And this is remarkable to think that an enslaved woman would write this. May the angels of heaven guard you and protect you while you're so far from your beloved home, is the prayer of your unworthy servants. We have to wonder what was in fact going on in her mind when she wrote these two letters to General Harding. And finally, we go to West Tennessee, which is heavily Confederate area. Memphis was not nearly as there were a lot of Confederate opposition within Memphis that did not exist in Nashville. Memphis had more problems during the war than Nashville did. And so I want to bring your attention here in the final minutes that we have to another remarkable story about an enslaved woman. This enslaved woman was Cheney Scott Black. She lived in McNairy County in West Tennessee, near the Tennessee River. Her mistress, Narcissa Black, was a very fine seamstress and weaver, and Narcissa had taught Cheney how to weave fabric, how to sew, and they organized interracial quilting bees. And indeed, Cheney Scott stayed on with her mistress after the Civil War ended. It was about 10 years, I guess it was about 1870 or 71, when Cheney finally decided to leave. She and Mrs. Black were together. The only means they really had to support themselves was by making quilts and selling these things, which apparently were really quite fine. But she saved up enough money in those years between the end of slavery and her departure to buy herself a loom, and she was very, very proud of that. And so indeed, she ultimately left and did not return. Again, another remarkable story in a part of Tennessee when you would not think that Narcissa Black would treat her enslaved woman quite that well. We've got lots of stories of women being spies. If you're a Southern Baptist, you know about the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. Well, Lottie Moon was a spy during part of the Civil War, as was her sister, Jenny Bethel Moon. They lived in Ohio, but were Confederate sympathizers and ultimately lived in Memphis. Her sister did a tremendous amount of spying, stealing drugs from Union hospitals and taking them to quinine especially, and morphine to Confederate encampments where the Confederate soldiers could have them. Jenny Moon seemed to work a great deal with Nathan Bedford Forrest, providing him information about troop movements in West Tennessee and giving him information, carrying messages from Confederates to Nathan Bedford Forrest. A remarkable story there with her as well. And Loretta Velasquez is another one of these women who decides she wants to fight in the Army. And so she will impersonate a man. And she did not write a diary. She wrote a memoir after the Civil War, and only when she was destitute. So historians who have examined this diary of hers think that she may have embellished her service to the Confederate cause. She said she fought at the Battle of Bull Run. Her husband died very early in the war. She fights in many battles. She says, she describes all of this. Before she dies, she will be married a total of 4 times. She will have a son, and it was only when she was destitute with this child to support that she wrote her diary about her memoir about her Civil War memories. So how embellished that is, we will not ever know, because we have no other record of her service. And finally came the peace. There are so many other stories that we could tell. Indeed, we could be telling these stories from now till the 4th of July, probably, about things that went on in Union families, in Confederate families. But finally, there was peace. The ex-Confederates had not expected to be beaten. People like General Harding had invested their gold in the Confederate cause, and were pretty well broke when the war ended, even though he was still very much alive. And as the Confederate women began the painful process of burying the Confederate dead, they do this because they see it as their duty, but they wonder how this war will be remembered. How will we be remembered as a people who supported this losing cause? And so it is right here that this mythology of the lost cause begins, that the war had nothing to do with slavery. And it is where the story of the Civil War on the part of the Confederacy is about honor and service. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy will be founded in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, I've got a 6:32 on my clock. Once again, I have run over. I apologize for that. A lot of the information that I talked about here, I really use two sources: the Tennessee Encyclopedia of History, which is online, but you can also buy a copy from the Tennessee Historical Society. They have a few copies left. You can buy a copy of it there. It's got a tremendous amount of information about many of these people and the battles and the war. It's got a long essay about the war in it. The Tennessee Historical Quarterly has articles about all of these battles and pretty much nearly all of the women's diaries. Now, I suppose this looks like somewhat like shameless self-promotion. This is our next series, which will begin next semester, so to speak, when school begins again in the fall, with 6 lectures on what took place after the Civil War, starting with the return, starting with the period that was called Reconstruction, the return of the ex-Confederates, moving on into the 20th century. I hope you will join us for that series. And here is your invitation to the annual membership meeting. Marjorie Spruill is a longtime friend of mine. We have collaborated throughout the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage a great deal. I've been on several panels with her, and you are in for a treat. She has a new edition. It's over 500 pages long and is filled with images of this book, One Woman, One Vote. It is really a fine book. I've seen parts of it, and you are in for